Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 74 of Get Out of Rat. Today, I'm joined by Alice Henderson, who is the customer care development lead for John Lewis. And we were introduced by a mutual friend. We've had a couple of chats already, and Alice has got a fascinating background, skill set. It's just perfect for the podcast. So, Alice, thanks for giving up your time and joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's quite an intro you've teed up there, Martin.
Yeah, no pressure, no pressure.
None. Oh no, but thank you for having me. I'm going to enjoy the next half an hour or so.
Yeah, well, me too. We were talking actually just at the start. I was just checking your getting your correct title with John Lewis, and you made an interesting point actually about how you actually do lots and lots of other things. Titles can be quite narrow sometimes, can't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we've restructured actually within customer care. So we've come together as John Lewis and Waitrose. So we're kind of a pan partnership customer care function now, which is great. So that sort of happened earlier this year, and as part of that restructure, yeah. So my role now is development lead, but it spans it's a whole breadth of helping support strategy development for our senior stakeholders, and a continuous improvement capability, and our communication strategy and implementation of change into our estate. So yeah, it's quite a wide remit, and but very exciting space to be in within contact centres because there is so much change at the moment. So
Yeah.
it's a brilliant area to work in.
Well, just the things you mentioned there: change, continuous improvement, communication, development. That those are kind of fundamental in contact centers, aren't they? But it's very wide.
Yeah, yeah, it is, and I've got a brilliant team that have come together under the restructure, and we're finding our feet and we're running with it, which is fantastic. And everybody is learning new elements to their role at the moment because some people have not got the waitress experience, others have got the John Lewis, some people have the change experience and not the CI. So it's quite an exciting time to build something. And face into the future for customer care.
That sounds great, and we'll get into that. Just to start with, how have you got to where you are today? What's been your history?
Well, I've actually been in the John Lewis partnership for 20 years. It will be next month.
Wow.
I know. I actually can't believe I'm saying it out loud, and and mainly I joined on a management training scheme way back and started in John Lewis Brent Cross, and then worked through various shops, and got my first taste of what a contact centre may be like when we initially, this was at least 15 years ago, sort of centralised. I say centralised, actually we didn't. We localised some of our contact centres within our shops, and kind of had regional contact centres, but actually the setup was nothing anywhere near what we have today in terms of the professional capability, the technical infrastructure required. But I found it fascinating then because the pace and the agility that you have to have within contact centres is just off the scale, and it was fascinating, and it just you're constantly needing to be agile and think on your feet, and it's quite impressive, and the scale of it and the size of it and the complexity of it as well. So but I carried on in my operational role, and then a role came up to work within contact centres about 8 years ago. So I became a project manager, and that was sort of my first foray away from operational roles into delivering change. And I just absolutely loved it. So for the last 8 years, I have stayed in contact centres, and they haven't been able to get rid of me at all. And my roles evolved from project manager into business development manager, and and then it has had various iterations to where it is today.
It sounds like you're well adept then at not just the pace, but dealing with change. How does this last like 2 year period compare with the previous kind of, let's say, 6 years, I guess, of contact centers in terms of just looking at change?
Oh gosh, so I think if I'm honest, I think the last couple of years have been everything has the ante's been upped absolutely in terms of what we needed to do, and so therefore I think everybody's degree of risk and how they assess the risk, and people's ability to work within that degree of risk has actually changed. So I think prior to that, I think the volume of change we were starting to see through our contact centre estate was already on an upward trajectory. But I think the game changer is the need for us to respond and react quickly in the last sort of 18 months, 2 years, has just meant that people's threshold for the level of risk that they need to accept to then implement that change. So actually, if it's 80% there, actually we can manage that risk because we've got a really good team. We're really focused on managing that and pushing it over the line to actually deliver on it. And but I think that only works with everybody coming together and really trying to make that a success. So whether that is people needing to get home within a matter of 2 to 3 weeks and us just building a plan to make that happen, and needing to accept the degree of risk that might come with that in terms of whether that is the operational infrastructure that's needed. But I think that's probably been the shift. But I actually think the volume of change is, I would say that even prior to that, it was still there, because the appetite to change the business and evolve the whole the John Lewis partnership and continue to strive for that customer service excellence was already there. I think this just helped trigger and fast track some of it. And I think I was thinking back to 6 years ago when, well, actually it's longer than that. I was thinking before I came on this program, I've actually been in this for 8 years now, but I keep using the same 6 years.
Yeah.
And I've forgotten.
Your mind's got stuck.
Yeah, I have. I think it's to do with COVID. Your mind gets stuck to a place before COVID, and then you forget the period of time in between. But I think for us, customer care has grown in its scale, and certainly the shift to online has really expedited that. But I think even prior to that, when it was first formed, because we had our outsourced contact centres and we've also got our in-house contact centres. And so when I joined the team 8 years ago, we were looking at about 30 pieces of change that wanted to be implemented within customer care. And I think prior to the COVID pandemic, we were tracking at about 150. Yeah. So we were facing into and 8 years ago we had change being delivered from so many different business areas that we didn't truly have the visibility that we needed. And when I say the teams, this is for the resource planners, this is for the MI teams, this is for quality and training, the knowledge managers. We just didn't have a funnel, a really good change governance in place that gave everybody a view of what was in the pipeline and equally an opportunity to prioritize it. So part of my journey was working with my colleagues and recruiting a member into my team who was brilliant to help govern the change, particularly from the central stakeholders that were coming up with some brilliant initiatives, but going straight into the operations. So sometimes resource planning didn't have visibility of what was happening within the operation that might be driving a brilliant benefit, but actually just didn't have a line of sight into it. So we built that formal change governance up from scratch. And so therefore, when the pandemic came upon us, we were actually already a really good framework within which people could operate. And so therefore, it was just bringing the focus and changing the change activities to support what was needed at the time, rather than having a big revolutionary change to how we approach delivering and implementing what was needed.
I love that idea of, for change governance, then what you're saying there is to ensure that all the various stakeholders are informed, involved. That communication element then must be critical. But how do you strike the balance between informing and involving, so that do you determine that? Because I just think if you want people to be aware, but then some people will come in and make unnecessary changes or change the target. And am I making any sense?
Yeah, no, you are. Well, I suppose there's two elements. There's one is the customer care strategy, and what are we doing within the contact center estate to drive forward and support the overall business plan for the whole of the John Lewis partnership. And so obviously that's more within our gift and our control and our sphere of influence, and obviously working with my head of customer care and the rest of our senior leadership team to help shape and define that. So then you've got a really clear roadmap of change, and you've got your strategy and what you want to be delivering on. And so then that forms part of that transformation roadmap. What you also have is you've got the central stakeholders, and so whether or not that's from trade, whether that's digital, marketing, etc. And you've got so many components of which the customer care team, they will touch all of those customer journeys. And I think there was a huge education piece that needed to be done, and still does. Actually, in terms of stakeholder engagement, that doesn't stop. That's a continual cycle. But what we needed to do once we created the change governance framework is actually make sure that we were engaging with those stakeholders. And actually, there is an appreciation that most of those stakeholders haven't come up through the contact center route in the industry. Yeah. So actually, there's a bit where sometimes we just acted as the translator. And we were almost the conduit. We were like, look, we don't expect you to understand what all the teams do and how they do it, but actually come and talk to us, and we can make sure that you're in contact with the right people. Because my team is certainly not the SMEs at all, but we would know who to go to for what. And I think what worked really well is when you do have that engagement, and you can then influence that change further upstream to make sure that it's developed. And we're not just talking about the projects that every company has where it's gone through the business case process. You're talking about the continuous improvement initiatives that people that want to see and drive forward within their own areas, and therefore will engage with us, and let's understand that change. And and there's the bit of honesty, which is, well, actually, if you want to implement it, you've got to come through us anyway, because we're almost the gatekeepers for customer care. But very much the approach is work with us, and then actually we can probably come up with something that's even better than what you've got planned, and help us, let us help you in that early development stage, and therefore we can then move them through our change process, and the change, we can get impact assessed as well. So everybody within customer care who's a key stakeholder will have an input, a formal input as well as an informal input into that change, to make sure that all the due considerations were made before we went through into implementation. And then my comms team have been fantastic in building a really good framework to help monitoring how that change has been landed. So, but it's not it's an ongoing process, so it never stops. The stakeholder engagement never stops, and the flow of change never stops. And as you can imagine, people move roles, so you need to be re-engaging all the time. But it's enabled us to then have really good visibility of what's coming, challenge some of those changes as well, to make sure it's absolutely fit for purpose, and then ultimately support the whole business in delivering that through.
You mentioned something earlier around in this last sort of period that the appetite for risk, or the relationship with risk has changed, right? So does that mean that you've had to sort of dial down perfectionism at the expense of just making sure you implement?
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know whether we have dialed down. Actually, yes, I would say it's taken away the need for perfectionism. Would I say, though, that the outcome's been any different? So have we implemented anything that has been not as good as it was had we gone through the perfectionist route? No, I don't think we did. I think we did something at pace and we implemented it. I think we mitigated the risk by just having a really great working group. So we built a sort of our home working team. We had a project team and from all areas of customer care, and we came together and we would meet regularly and implement the activities on our plan. But I think the speed of which we were doing it, because we were communicating so consistently and we were delivering in such an agile manner, that it worked really well. So even though we might be going live with something where there was a degree of risk, so whether that is the speed of which we recruited our partners, because we had a pool of experts within our working group that knew what was happening and therefore knew their role to play and how to support it, that all came together really well. It did remove that need for perfectionism, absolutely. But did it impact the outcome? Probably not, which is quite, there's a big learn in itself that it's okay to go with something without necessarily dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's before you go with it.
I guess in that kind of scenario you just painted there, I can imagine if you're dealing with experts and you're saying to them, we need to get this many partners in by this time, can you do it? Them saying, yeah, we can. It's more about the impetus, isn't it? It's the buy-in to the need for implementation because of context and where everyone was at that kind of point. That's the key. But you mentioned earlier about the kind of volume of change that you've had to deliver. How do you cope with that, with all these different stakeholders? And some, I imagine, are very senior stakeholders, but how do you cope with the volume of change, and how do you prioritize effectively?
So I think that's still one of our biggest challenges, if I'm honest. And I don't think we've necessarily nailed it. We have a different approach now to what we probably had 3 years ago, where depending on the type of change that it is. So is it something that, how regular would an agent, or we call them partners if they're our in-house teams, how regularly would they need to access that information? So therefore, is that something that just goes straight onto the knowledge base and might be nodded to within a newsletter format or some other content? Or is it something where it's actually formalized and this is a consistent process you use all the time, and we need to now create something that's rigid in terms of its training approach to make sure that everybody is clear on what the new process and way of working is? So I think the way that you do it is almost look at the type of change, and therefore, because you would never approach every single one in the same way, and therefore you then look at, and this is a very live discussion I'm having with my team at the moment around what does a healthy change month look like, and actually when do you know you've reached saturation point? And we've got teams where we know and the thing is, because it's so vast, the different operational areas, it's not consistent across the entire estate when you might get those pinch points. So we've got a team at the moment where we know they've got about 11 things that need to land within a 6-week period. So the conversations are very much, but because we've got the change governance, we can see that. And then we've got our communication plan. We can see that there's a bottleneck. And so that's where we would have intervene, and my team would have conversations with the operations managers, but also with the stakeholders that want to implement change into that estate, to come up with a plan around how can we execute this and implement this effectively, and actually what's right for the partners that are receiving that change, and where's the priority lie within each element of that change, and what's the biggest benefit that each of these pieces of work are going to bring. And you kind of need to look at all those components and bring them together. So it's not done to the operation, and that you work with them, and you agree that together. And some of the outcomes of those conversations will be, and that's where part of my team's role comes to the fore, is it's going back to those central stakeholders and explaining if something needs to be amended in our approach, why, and how it's still going to be a benefit to them, and enabling them to understand the risk if it did go ahead. So there's quite a few components, but I think by having that structure and framework in place already means that you can work really well within it. And there are some, and it's very rare that we do, but there are some occasions where we'll receive some change, and actually we look at it and we may well reject it, but we'll need to go back and be really clear on the reasons why. But it just gives us an opportunity to have that open and honest conversation, because ultimately we need to strike the balance of supporting the business strategy, but equally protecting the customer care operation as well.
I guess is it the ability for people to embed the change and for it to be effective and long lasting? Are you the kind of guardians, gatekeepers of when that's delivered, so that people aren't kind of, I've been in situations where in operations I think you're used to like you said before, the pace, the agility, the amount of change. You're kind of used to it after a while in a contact center operations. But if there's too much, it becomes exhausting, and you can very quickly become a bit blasé about it. So are you guys the guardians of that implementation? The kind of air traffic control, who's coming into land, and all of that kind of stuff.
I think we create the framework for it, and we absolutely make sure all the change is captured. But I think in terms of the guardians, it's quite a collective effort. So we work really closely with the resource planners to know that from a capacity point of view, that we can land this change at this moment in time. And then equally, we work really closely with the operation to understand the capacity. And that's one of the future plans of ours with our CI capability. Is there's some brilliant continuous improvement happening across the operation at the moment, but actually we haven't quite got visibility of everything. So there could be pockets of activity that we're not necessarily aware of, that some brilliant improvements going on, but actually it won't then flag to us there might be change saturation going on, because we don't think that's necessarily happening. So there's some more exciting work for us to do to give the full visibility. But it's probably not necessarily for us to dictate. We can flag if we think there's a risk, but we work so closely with resource planning and the operation that our regular weekly meetings kind of flag just organically if we know that there's going to be a risk or issue to that. And where there is significant risks or issues, then we have a sort of escalation route into our senior stakeholders to describe what the risk may well be or what the issue may be, and then come up with some recommendations of how we're going to mitigate that. So the framework so far has worked quite well in that way, where there might be risks or issues.
And you and your team have helped shape the strategy for customer care with senior leaders. Was that organically as part of the process that because you're going across the operation, across different stakeholders? That must be quite exciting to be able to play such a key role in what your customer care strategy is.
Yeah, it's really exciting. So again, it's just pulling together, looking at the external insight, our internal insight, and bringing our senior leadership team together to really start framing what do the next 2 to 5 years need to look like, and what do we need to do within customer care to support the overall service strategy for the business, and therefore where are we now and where do we want to get to. But that entire process, that wasn't a 2-month process. That's a 12-month process, making sure that we've got the right input and engagement, and that it's based on some really good insights to get us where we need to be. And now we've got what we call our service ambitions, and we've got our sort of accountable owners to lead on that. So again, it's just about creating the right governance and framework and the right clear direction and the clear outcomes that we want to achieve, that's enabling everybody to pick that up and ultimately run with it and start delivering on it. And as a result of the restructure early this year, we've now got a brilliant senior leadership team to help drive that forwards.
I love that phrase then. You said service ambitions.
Service ambitions, yeah.
Can you tell me about them? They sound great.
Well, there's 6 levers for us. You're now going to challenge me on what they are, aren't you? And expect me to roll it off the bat.
You could say there were 4.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, there's the obvious one, the guiding light one is our service. I mean, that John Lewis and Waitrose, that is absolutely what we're known for in terms of the quality of our products, but also the service that we deliver. And so actually it's defining what does brilliant personalized service experience for our customers look like, and obviously making sure that we reduce the customer effort. And then you've got the adding insight. So we're really honing in on speech analytics at the moment and really starting to understand the opportunities there and build that capability alongside our other insight sources. And then simplification. I think probably every contact centre will say the same thing. Actually, particularly for us, the growth in online trade has been huge this year. So how do we make sure that we've got really simplified processes for our emerging digital customers especially, and make sure that our self-serve capability is where it needs to be, but equally that we've got 80% of our partners now home working, and actually what does that technical infrastructure now need to be, and how do we create a simplified desktop that's going to support that, and then how do we really leverage the fact that we've got our home working strategy, and how do we leverage greater flexibility and operational efficiency through that opportunity as well. So there's a whole host of elements that sit under our service ambitions. We're just on the cusp of starting. Well, we've started all that work actually, but really motoring for it for the next 18 to 24 months.
Some of your phraseology is I love. I've always liked.
Do you really? Because I feel like I'm waffling, Martin.
No, I do. I love some of the. I've always liked partners as a term, because I think.
But seriously, am I waffling? I know you can edit this out. How am I doing?
No, you're doing great. I don't bother editing anymore. I haven't got time. So you're done. No, you're doing great. It's really genuinely, it's interesting. I didn't get though. So you said service ambitions, and then there was something about accountable. Was it accountable experts? No, what was it?
Well, no, accountable owners.
Accountable owners. See, I'm writing this down because I like this. You're not waffling. That's what the podcast is for, anyway.
Oh, good. No, so I think so the service ambitions ultimately is kind of our strategy of how we're going to achieve market leading service. And I think the bit for me was actually it's great that you have a strategy, but if you're not clear on who's accountable for delivering against each of those outcomes, then you're going to set yourself up to fail. And so that's why we spent a lot of time with the strategy being really clear on what's the key goals and outcomes that we want to see, and then who's going to be accountable for delivering on that. And then actually the space and the freedom should be in how you choose to achieve that goal and that outcome. That shouldn't be set out in a strategy. That should be for someone to be able to take and run with and deliver and work with others to achieve that shared goal. And so far it's got off the ground and it's running really well. And that sort of setup seems to have been taken off brilliantly.
I love that, because I hasten to add, not where I am at the moment, but I have worked somewhere where the strategy was something that you might look at as senior leaders once a year and kind of go through it and go, oh, this looks like it's written for my area. This is interesting. But without that kind of accountability, it's nothing. It's just a set of nice intentions and words. The accountability, I think, is great. And also that people do have the freedom then, if it's their area, to determine how that is implemented and what those goals or how that strategy turns into goals. That's really important, isn't it? Because you're kind of giving people kudos for their expertise and saying, tell us how this is going to be done. I think is great.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I think in the past, you can create a strategy and then you might come and look at it once a quarter, once every 6 months, and then you sort of go, oh, have we done that? Have we not? Whereas this one, we meet once a month, everybody runs through actually what they've progressed on, what they still need to get to, and almost use it as a program of work. And where the risks and issues, and then review the metrics that we declared are our key metrics that we want to drive forward as a result. And where we've started to deliver on activities, then are we seeing that flow through into our KPIs? And if not, why not? And what are we going to do about it, and what are the interventions that are needed? I think you probably want to ask me in about 12 months' time if that's been successful, because we're a few months in yet, but the framework seems to be working. The delivery, that's really the proof in the pudding, isn't it?
Mm. Yeah. How was it seems like externally, it seems like a natural fit, Waitrose and John Lewis. But when did that start? Was that just at the outset of the pandemic? Like, we were talking before, like, time's a bit strange at the moment, isn't it? But
yeah, what do you mean, as in when they came together under one? So John Lewis and Waitrose came under one head of customer care. So my head of customer care, Ray Biggs. So that was just before the pandemic. And then the senior leadership restructure was delayed as a result of the pandemic. So it's now live this year. But as a result, it just happened to be great timing as well, because what we found is our Waitrose colleagues, naturally the volume into customer care was phenomenal. It went through the roof, and particularly with our vulnerable customers. And so whilst they went into heavy recruitment within our outsource estate, actually we had our John Lewis partners where, we had the shops that were shutting, and therefore the volume of work within some area pockets of our contact centre estate in John Lewis where the volume had dropped off. So we were able to upskill really quickly our operational partners that could support our Waitrose colleagues with those vulnerable customers. And so that's worked really well. And therefore just enabled the service levels to, they were still challenged. I don't think there was any area of the industry that wasn't, but it certainly supported a really important area of our business at the time. And, the supermarkets, obviously that's where the biggest stress and strain was for us in retail. So it was really great to be able to take that opportunity where we've got one leadership team to really help support. And And equally with homeworking as well, that's almost by default has created an environment where you've just naturally got more flexibility, and therefore we've got more partners trained and upskilled in different areas than we ever have before. And that's absolutely just kind of driven that forward at a pace that I think if COVID didn't happen, we wouldn't have done.
What's your current thinking around how this is going to work in terms of, will you have a hybrid, or because actually you must have been behind that as well, I guess.
Yeah, so our approach to, we call it distributed working strategy, because it's not a hybrid as such, because we have recruited permanent home workers. So we have contracted home working partners, as well as those that are at home versus those that are 100% on site, because we've got some processes that must just be completed on site. So actually we've got quite a few areas to consider within our distributed working strategy. So it's not necessarily just hybrid, but we absolutely are taking the approach that it's through choice. So we asked our partners, what would you like to do? Would you want to continue home working? And the vast majority, just over 80%, said actually we'd like some form of home working going forwards. Yes, absolutely. And naturally, during COVID, you may have a certain frame of mind 12 months ago to what you did now. So then we surveyed again and asked them again, what would you like? And actually came out with the same results. So we're not doing anything fast, because actually at the moment times are still uncertain, but we're absolutely putting the well-being of our partners front and center to anything that we do. And the premise is more around giving partners a choice where it's operationally possible to do so. So we haven't been rigid at the moment. We've where we can, where we've been able to do it safely, is we've created some space within the sites where partners can opt to come in, because you have to recognise that people have been at home for 18 months, and some partners just haven't come back on site during that period at all. Now, obviously, you need to make sure that you're following the government guidelines, and that safety is paramount, but there is a need for people to connect now. So how do we then build what we want the right contact centre of the future to look like, and the right distributed working strategy? And we're not rushing to that, because I still think it needs to be more time for people to really formalise what they want their balance of work life to be, and how they want that to fit in. But so far I'm really proud of how we've approached it, because it's all been around the partner's well-being and what will support them, and then by default actually the operational flexibility and efficiency will follow.
What was your preference personally? How have you answered that question?
Well, I quite enjoy the home working, but that's because I also have 2 kids. So in terms of building greater flexibility for school runs and everything else, that's really opened up a door for us that we didn't have before. But my God, do I miss seeing my team. I tried to fly up to Manchester a few weeks ago, and that failed just because my daughter went into isolation. I was like, no, can't do it. I miss seeing them, absolutely. But I'm in Reading next week, and we've got 4 or 5 of us coming together. So it gets you far too excited, though.
Yeah. I was the same.
And then when you go in the office, you get very frustrated that you actually don't get any work done, because
you're just too busy chatting to people
and catching up, which is lovely. So I think I'll end up doing a balance. I think I'll definitely still be more time at home, but when I'm on the road, it will be earmarked and cleared for that connection time that I really enjoy.
And what does the future entail for for your team? Lots and lots of change. Is there an area that you're responsible for, whether it's continuous improvement, that has maybe more going on than another area? What's the next 12 months, or is that hard to predict?
Yeah, I think they all weave together. I don't think you can have one without the other, actually. So I think we've got, we're developing, because of our service ambitions, we've got half of my team will be developing new work to support that, or implementing on change from either our own change or the wider estate. CI capability is also a really big one that we want to build on. I think there is, I think what's really nice with the CI capability is that because that's new for our team, that we can just shape that and make that into something that's really going to support the operation and drive a benefit. And the operational teams already do their own continuous improvement within their own areas. So it's actually defining for us, how do we then make sure that we're growing the CI capability and identifying opportunities that help just build and support our service ambitions. And first contact resolution's a really good example of that. A member of my team, Gillian, has been driving that forwards. So it's thinking about continuous improvement in a sense of actually what's the breakthrough improvements that we need to make that's going to help support our service ambitions. And then we've got our communication strategy. So again, as my comms team are fantastic, but they are definitely using some of our technical capability. It's absolutely sticky plaster stuff at the moment. It's creaking at the seams, and they've made the best that they can with it. So it's more around what's the right strategic solution for that then, and how do we develop that, and what does that look like, and what's the investment that's required to support our entire estate. So I think all of them have their unique areas and requirements to drive forwards. So I wouldn't say it was one thing, actually. I think it's more around the collective coming together, and if we can achieve all of that, then we've really helped drive our strategy forwards.
I think there'll probably be people listening that kind of listen to you talk so well about the impact your function has, but maybe they don't have that function in place. How would somebody go about starting to get the same thing that you guys have in place? Where would you start?
Well, to be honest, you've got to start with your sponsor being on board with that vision. So if I go back to 6 years ago, it was a conversation with my boss at the time, who we could just see there was an opportunity. We knew that we were not quite in this state of chaos, but we had a situation where we had our central stakeholders delivering change into our estate. And then suddenly we were X million adrift of our budget, but we didn't actually know why. And then when we started looking into the detail, we realized we'd agreed to support this change here, this change here, this change here, and this change just nudged up by 0.2 FTE, and this one just nudged it by 0.5. But once you start adding that all up collectively, those sums start to add up, and then we suddenly realized why we were adrift. And that then was the trigger point for, okay, well, we need to invest at the time we called Becky a project coordinator, but Becky came on board and basically helped build the framework. We had a vision of what we wanted, but we didn't know how we were going to get there at that point. We just knew that we needed the change governance to give us the visibility that we needed to make sure that change that was coming in was going to land better than it was, that we had visibility, and therefore we could resource plan in the right way to support that change, and equally challenge on it sometimes, because if we felt that it didn't align to the strategy, let's have that open and honest conversation at that time, because what one business area might think is going to be an absolute benefit actually could be a really poor experience within a customer journey through customer care, and people don't necessarily know that because they're not experts in customer care. So I think you've got to have the support of whoever your head of is, or your sponsor. They've got to be behind that vision and see the benefit of that playing through. And it, small investment of having one person come on board to help start that process, and then building out your stakeholder, your working group, your stakeholder group that's going to help bring that together. And there was so many iterations. I mean, if Becky was on the call, the amount of times that we had feedback sessions, and every few months we're like, what do we need to improve? Even after every change control group call, we're right, let's assess, let's evaluate, how did that go, what do we need to improve, how do we get that visibility? Really important that we work really closely with our insight teams, our resource planners, quality and training team, to make sure they were getting what they needed from that process, because if they didn't, it was going to fail. So I mean, the teamwork that we needed to make sure that we had in place, and being really open and honest in accepting that we needed to evolve. And so now what we've got today, it didn't happen overnight. It's been, several years, and it's seen several iterations of it. And it's now working so well that we've got some of our head office stakeholders coming to us in different business areas after they've had their restructure, going, oh, we can hear you've got a process in place that works really well for customer care. Can we learn about it? And can we understand what it is that you do and why you find it so effective? Right. And so that's the proof in the pudding, when you're getting approached by people that have seen it work and seen how it's been of a benefit either to them or to somebody else. So that kind of makes it all worthwhile.
And I love that idea you mentioned of, and I've seen it work really effectively, where and it's often overlooked, isn't it? It's the concept of the debrief. So regardless of result, what happened, and how could we, what went well, how do we do more of it? What didn't go well, how do we improve? And if sounds like you've got yourself into that habit then of just continually doing that. Did you have to get people's buy-in to do that to start with? Especially after things have gone well, I guess people just want to keep going.
I mean, there was different approaches. I think when you're asking people for feedback, I think sometimes you don't need to, in the sense that if you're in the meeting, you can see for yourself what's not going particularly well, and therefore what needs to evolve. But I think it wasn't difficult to get feedback, because I think the way in which we did it, we tried several different ways. Sometimes we got groups together to say, right, just tell us exactly what's working for you, what isn't. That worked really well. And then a second time that we did it, we just went out individually and made sure that we targeted teams, said, okay, so for our resource planning reps, actually what are you finding is really good in this process? What needs to be added to next year? And we almost just made it part of our cycle of improvements to that process. So they were so used to it. I think the important thing is that you took on board that feedback and then you did it, because if you didn't, then of course they're not going to follow that. And so I think it was never really a hard sell, but it wasn't a hard sell because the likes of Becky and Tracy and my team were responsive to that feedback. And I think that's the bit. If you're already in that mindset, then the rest just flows quite naturally. And therefore we've now got a really well-oiled machine. But even then, we're still not sat on our laurels. So we'll still go, right, let's look at it again. Let's be critical. What else needs to improve? And, as the business continues to grow as well, I'm sure, in 3 years' time, it may look completely different to what it does now, because it's always needed to evolve based on the needs of either the customer care, our contact centre estate, or the wider business.
Well, Alice, despite you thinking you've fluffed a response, you're obviously an SME. You come across really well. I've definitely learned a lot. What, from you personally, if you were to give advice to someone listening who might want to follow the same career path as you, what would you say to them? And obviously, I'm assuming you'd be open to people contacting you anyway for a more in-depth answer. But for the purpose of today, what's the kind of a really important thing for you and your own personal growth and how you've got to where you are now?
Oh God, that's a really interesting question. The best advice is, I think you need to really listen and understand everybody else's perspective. So if you want to get into change, then a lot of it is around understanding what needs to be delivered and the benefits, but equally what are the needs of everybody else. So I think the collaboration is probably the key takeaway. You can't do anything on your own, and you shouldn't do anything really, I think, on your own. You've got to work with all your stakeholders, and I think that's what's been really successful, is really understanding the needs. So whether that is the needs of the teams that are on the phones or on social or on email, whether that's the needs of the operation, or whether that's the needs of resource planning or the insight team, is making sure you spend time really listening, and then equally collaborating to then build something that's going to be really effective tool. And then I think, I'm really blessed with a really great senior leadership team that really support and endorse that. And so therefore you need to have that as well. You need to have that in place. But more than happy to talk to anyone about my particular journey. Open to that anytime.
That's great. Alice Henderson, thank you very much. This has been really interesting.
Thank you, Martin. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Good. Thanks. Bye-bye.